everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the finance panel. Pnawn da pawb. Can I welcome Councillor David Thomas, portfolio holder, and Jane and her senior finance team, as well as Lynn, who's observing who's the chair of the Audit and Governance Committee. So good to see you, Lynn. I know some of you have had a long day already in governance and audit this morning. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Right, item 1, apologies. Kath, is it just the one we've had so far?
Yes, we've had apologies from Councillor Jeremy Pugh and from Anne Phillips, interim or head of finance.
Okay, great. Thank you. Item 2 is a declarations of interest. We all know what's that about. And so we'll go, please declare if there's anything that comes up during the meeting. So we can go straight to item 3, the Q1 revenue forecast for this current financial year as of 30th of June. David, Councillor David, would you like just to give us a very quick overview, and perhaps Jane can also give a few highlights as well?
Thank you, Chair. I'll give a high-level overview of the report that you've got in front of you, and obviously at the end of it, any questions you have, I'm sure Jane will assist me in answering them as best we can. So this is the revenue budget outturn forecast for 24-25 financial year, which is based on the position as at the 30th of June 2024. The projected position currently reports an overall £55,000 overspend after considering £199,000 overspend on the school's dedicated budget and a £51,000 overspend on the housing revenue account. When these ring-fence budgets are excluded, the overall position is an underspend of £195,000. It's worth noting that this forecast is being made at a relatively early stage in the financial year. The overall forecast position combines the £2 million forecast overspend on children's services, the forecast overspend of £800,000 on school improvement and learning, and a forecast overspend of £500,000 on highways, transport and recycling, which are counterbalanced by a £3 million risk budget, which has not been allocated as yet. Section 5 of the report sets out the proposed environments, which include requests for the use of some of the risk budget. £400,000 for highways, transport and recycling in relation to highways operations, £400,000 for education, £200,000 for schools dedicated. Again, this financial year, there's an overspend projected for children's services as the number of children needing placements increases. Complexity of need and a shortage of places is also driving up the cost of the individual placements. Appendix A of the report provides more detail at a service level, with heads of service providing detailed commentary in Appendix B. We look at cost reductions. Services have already begun to deliver the cost reduction plan this year. The budget approved included cost reductions of £10.7 million. In addition, the mothballing of children's services in-house residential scheme of £0.5 million, plus undelivered savings from previous years totaling £1.7 million, have been rolled forward, giving a total of £12.9 million of cost reductions that need to be delivered this year. On reserves, the reserves position is reported in Table 3, which shows the use of £25.8 million of specific reserves to support the Council's budget this year. Approximately half of this relates to revenue grants received in 23-24, rolled forward through specific reserves to fund planned expenditure in 24-25. Schools forecast an expected call on their reserves of just under £3 million in this financial year. If this were to be the case, this would result in an overall deficit on schools' reserves of just under £2 million. These are challenging times for our schools, and the authority continues to provide an appropriate level of challenge and support to assist schools with their budget recovery plans. With regard to grants, section 511 to 514 report additional grants received during this quarter in relation to education, waste and local bus services, which will be incorporated into the budget. Section 5 of the report also sets out a number of environments to be considered by Cabinet. In summary, these include, and the first ones are for decision by Cabinet, and they are in section 5.2 of the report. £375,000 from the risk budget to education to fund a 52-week residential placement for a learner with complex additional learning needs directed by an educational tribunal. £200,000 from risk to the school's delegated budget as a result of a significant increase in the number of learners funded within the special school sector. £120,000 from the ALN transformation budget, originally allocated for nurture provision to the pupil referral unit budget. £151,000 from third-party budgets for direct payments, information and advice service to staffing budgets, as this service is now provided in-house following the TUPE of employees to adult services in Powys County Council. £365,000 from the risk budget to highways operations. This pressure was recognised as a risk in the budget process for 24-25. £389,000 transfer from the flood risk reserve to highways operations for flooding related expenses costs. £384,000 810 from the school's transport equalisation reserve due to the number of school days to be met in this financial year. £200,000 from transport services to the school's transport budget following the receipt of grant income, and £328,620 from the specific reserve for backlog remedial repairs to fund the cost of ongoing remedial repair work in this financial year. There are also two environments which will have to be approved by Cabinet and then sent on to full council for approval, and that is £721,282 in adult social care as a result of the award of housing support grants for 24-25 to provide support to prevent homelessness, and £587,083 in adult social care to increase the section 33 pooled budget with Powys Teaching Health Board in relation to funded nursing care. Powys County Council are the lead budget holder and commissioner for these arrangements. If we look at the financial risks, they're laid out in detail in section 6 of the report, and the financial risks we continue to face, and these will be discussed in greater detail as part of the financial planning update, which will be coming to you towards the end of today's agenda. And the Director of Corporate Services, the section 151 officer's comments are provided in section 7, but I will take the opportunity at this stage, Chair, if I may, to invite the 151 officer to comment on the report.
Thank you very much, David. Jane.
Thank you. I'm not going to add anything significant. I think much of what I would say will probably refer to both this and the financial planning update. So I think we'll probably have a more in-depth discussion when we get to that report. It's just to note really that the outturn position at the end of last year was favourable for us. We did take that opportunity to bolster our resilience in the current financial year, and you'll see the draw on reserves that we're already building into the budget plan was a result of some of that work. So just to highlight that, but just as well to highlight, and you'll see, as I said, from the update report, that we do have a significant challenge ahead of us from a financial perspective over the next 5 years. And again, we'll touch on that in more detail, I think, in the subsequent report.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you both. It is good to see the first quarter forecast coming in fairly close to the mark. In the past, we've seen, I remember during the COVID years, projected budgets being wildly off the mark. So it's really good to see that. Members, questions, please. Karina.
I was just going to comment that I still consider myself to be a fairly new councillor. It's very clearly laid out, and it seems you're keeping a really tight rein. You're not letting things get away from us. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and yeah, thanks, David and Jane, for the report and the extra commentary around that. I was just trying to understand a little bit in section 5.23 on page 7, the environment for the pupil referral unit, which I think it says is to mitigate an element of the PRU saving. And I just had a couple of thoughts, which was I wondered why, when I thought the additional learning need provision is under pressure in schools, we're actually using this budget. And then in addition, I saw a report this week stating that a recent ESTIN inspection at the PRUs identified several critical areas for improvement. And then a spokesman for Powys said that an action plan was being drawn up to address these recommendations. So I guess my question was off the back of that is, does the environment request and that report mean that we aren't pursuing closing either one of the PRUs now? And if so, what would be the impact of not realising the potential savings that we budgeted for, which I think were around about £500,000? Thank you, Chair.
I think it's 340 odd thousand, wasn't it? I think the
this year and 250 odd next year, Chair.
Yeah. Okay. Jane or David?
I'll come in, I think. In terms of the detail around some of those questions, and it was quite a lengthy question, Councillor Peat, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover all of it, but I think unfortunately we've got a number of corporate meetings on this afternoon, so we haven't got heads of service necessarily able to attend here as well. So I think we would probably need to take some of that back to the head of service. We have a new head of service in place, and I know they have been reviewing the budget position starting from scratch, realistically, from their perspective. And I think there has been some concern about some of the proposed changes that were there, and that is what is being reviewed here. So budgets are being realigned as part of that review. So I think I'll probably leave it at that and get the head of service perhaps to do some notes for the panel to actually highlight any further changes in that area. I hope that's acceptable, Chair.
It is really. Oh, Pete, perhaps you can come back first if you like on this.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Jane. Yeah, I guess my only overarching comment there, and you know, it was a big reason behind my question around have we changed our mind on the PRUs, is the impact that this delay continues to have on the staff that are working at the PRUs and the uncertainty there around their futures. So yes, I think good to have a note coming back to finance panel, but we probably need to publicise a change of mind further and sooner. Thank you.
I can see you nodding, Elwyn. You had your hand up earlier. Did you want to come in on this particular issue to skip Gareth and Chris for a moment or not?
Well, thank you. That basically, Councillor Peat has asked exactly what I was going to flag up, basically word for word. So I'm happy with that. But it is imperative clarification is sought.
Yeah. Can I just say, Chair, that there is something in the head of service commentary
in the
in Appendix B at the very end there, but I don't know. I don't think that answers fully what Councillor Peat was asking, but there is a bit more information there with regard to that environment.
But it is difficult for councillors who are slightly outside the loop to set a budget a few weeks ago, and then in the first quarter it seems as though the direction has completely changed. With I don't know whether it's due to appointments of a new director and new head of service. Is that the main reason for it, or were they completely unsustainable suggestions or changes in service delivery back when the budget was set? Because it's been through scrutiny and by cabinet at a cabinet level and at a scrutiny level as well. So it is really a little bit worrying when there's such an abrupt change of direction. I'm pleased that Learning and Skills will also take it up at some point, no doubt. But of course, if we were going in the wrong direction, it's important that we do assess it and change that course. Councillor Gareth.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, just in table 2 and just looking at the corporate activities and basically central services, I have got concerns that our central services, because we're talking about these cost reductions across, and it is going to come around people. And I've got concerns that our central services are stretched. And this report obviously doesn't really go into that kind of detail. But obviously without this support of central services around HR and other facilities, as we go on, not this year and also rolling into the next years, the amount of well, I can't remember how many million, is it 60 million we've got to save over there or thereabouts over the next quarter of this council period. I'm concerned that actually this will, you know, reduce the opportunity for reductions, and also allow us, because we've got to be realistic when we're talking that kind of money. There are, you know, jobs are going to be at risk when we're talking around 60 million, because otherwise we're just taking money from the frontline services delivering to people and just employing people to push a piece of paper around. And I don't mean that in a bad, you know, as a way, because we are about the people in the council. So my concern is, you know, realistically, are we in a position in central services to support and deliver these? And looking at the projects and the grant funding come in, they're going to be on time sensitive. If we haven't got the processes and support in place, we're just creating further financial problems later on this year and also in years to come. So it's just a comment really around that. Have we got the support systems in place in central services to deliver these savings? Because looking at it, the corporate activities we've already, and workforce development, I know that's a small amount, but look at digital services, business intelligence, they've delivered most of their savings now. But the trouble is, if we take too much out of there, we're not going to be able to assist in the savings in other departments.
Jane, I'm guessing 1 or 2 of these about staff restructures a little bit.
Yeah.
So, Jane.
Yeah, I think if I can pick up on that, I think as you rightly pointed out, corporate services play a very important role in supporting the organisation and supporting the transformation of the organisation too. So I want to give you some assurance that the savings or the efficiencies that we're able to put forward at the moment are around changes in process and making things more efficient, rather than just taking posts out of the structure when we need them. That isn't the case. We are looking to make the efficiencies in a planned way and releasing staff usually through general slippage rather than making any redundancies or anything. But we're looking for every opportunity there. And part of the saving is around managing our contracts effectively and driving down those costs as well. So all of those things are what you're seeing coming through there in terms of the figures against those corporate services. I think while we appreciate, and I think generally the council appreciates the value of those services, but we too have to demonstrate that value and the value for money that those services can give. So, you know, we are under exactly the same scrutiny as anybody else, but at the moment we are not looking for significant reductions across those teams, because we realise that the role that they will play now over the next couple of years. I hope that gives you the assurance you're looking for.
Not really, because obviously the issue being is, are these teams big enough to deal with the plan going forward? Because sometimes we're going to have to invest in certain services to allow us to deliver savings elsewhere. If we haven't got the corporate central services in place, and you know, and through natural slippage, I've heard that over the last 17 years on the council, you know, we don't want to make redundancies through, you know, through natural wastes and slippage. That, you know, we got to be realistic. The authority is to making mass amounts of saving, you know, make mass amounts of savings, and this is going to affect people, and it's going to affect change, and there will be job losses along the line. But if we're not in the position that if we need to get that forward thinking 2 years down the line, well, actually, it's going to put us back 2 years, which is going to make even more savings. Sometimes you've got to bite the bullet and actually get on with it to make the savings. The longer you leave it, the more. And my only concern is, are we flexible within the central services to deliver the long-term plan? Because if we're not, we can end up with all, you know, we can make all the political decisions we want, but if we haven't been able to, you know, deliver them because we cut the meat to the bone in the wrong areas. And yes, there is a time to slim back central services, but central services is going to be key in delivering the savings. And I've got grave concerns over that we are not thinking of the business acumen going forward, and it's kind of, we're doing hand to mouth finance year to year, where we need a long-term plan over the next 4 or 5 years.
I'm not sure if you want to come back on that or not.
I
Jane.
probably
Understand that,
can't add much to what I've said. I think
Yeah.
we have, just to give you, we have put some additional support into some of the services, HR particularly. We're looking to put additional support in there. So if we are identifying slippage in our budgets, you know, we're really focusing on utilising that to put additional support in those teams to help with the massive task ahead of us in terms of driving the change across the council. So yes, I think we are in a position where we're relatively sound at the moment, but obviously we keep that under constant review.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks both. Chris. Chris, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chair. And apologies, my camera's off. I've got a very intermittent internet at the moment for some unknown reason. No, I think this report is helpful because it provides lots of detail, and as you said, Chair, we've got that early on, and I think that's helpful to gain a picture and an insight so close to it after the end of Q1. The question for me is, Jane and maybe David, are we at the position that we want to be at this stage in the cycle? Of only having a very small overspend at this point compared to where we've got to get to, or are we out, or should we be having more savings at this point in time? And then just picking up on what Councillor Gareth had mentioned about services. I'm going to raise digital services again, because I think going forward, if we're looking at sustainable powers, digital services are going to be one of the key components to make some of this happen. As I mentioned in the governance meeting this morning, there was issues about cybersecurity and cyber outage, which can then cause problems of being able to deliver services when they go down, as we experienced last week with the Microsoft issue going forward. And even today with the Olympics, one of the railway services has gone down, which then says you need a reliance and a real strength in your digital support services. So I'm just checking that, you know, the reduction in some of the savings, is that leaving us exposed? And if we are doing that, do we lose people, particularly if they've been grant funded, because we'll lose that expertise, and then we've got a time lag to get that experience and that expertise back into the team going forward? And that on there, and I'll stop there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Jane, do you want to come back on that one?
I will. I'll try and cover off both points. So I think the first one was about where we are at this point in the year and whether that was as expected. I think in terms of what you're seeing for Q1, it's a reasonable position to be in. We did set aside the risk budget to cover off some of the risks we'd identified and the pressures we hadn't fully funded at the point at the start of the year, and we're starting to draw on that reserve not reserve, it's a budget, sorry, as expected. So I think the position is reasonable. I am pleased to see the delivery in terms of the cost reductions to date, and the assurance around more delivery of more of those. So I think that is a good position to be in. So I'm relatively comfortable in terms of where we are and where we're reporting at Q1. That being said, there is still a lot of risk in the budget, one of which a key risk there is around pay. Local government pay hasn't been approved as yet in terms of the current financial year. So although we've made provision for that, I think the discussions at the moment are above that level that we've built into budget plans. We do hold a reserve to offset that risk, but that is something we are keeping a keen eye on as we move through the year. And demand can always have a significant change on our budget plan. So clearly we're monitoring those aspects as well. From a digital perspective, as you know, digital now sits under my role as the Director of Corporate Services. We do have two elements to our digital team. We have a core element that really does all the nuts and bolts stuff that you sort of mentioned, including that cyber piece and making sure we have the security and that we are constantly watching and monitoring those cyber threats. So that is something that we are very mindful of and have that as part of our core team. In addition to that, we do draw significantly from the transformation budget. We do that on an annual basis, although we do recognise that the appointment of staff, you need to do that permanently, and we've taken that. You know, we do that because we see digital transformation as being a significant part of the council's journey over the next few years. So we have a significant investment in that team. And not only are they looking at the new opportunities and working with services in a really flexible way to be able to respond to that, but they also, that team, help with the implementation of new systems as they come on and so forth as well. So I think the digital team's in a good place in terms of that coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just say that, yeah, I'd agree with Jane. I'm comfortable where we are at Q1. In actual fact, as it says in 2.2, if you take the ring fenced figures out of it, we're actually projecting an underspend of £195,000. But obviously, we're looking at the overall budgets, but there are certain areas within that, service areas, that need closer attention than others. It goes without saying, and I'm sure that heads of services and directors have already picked that up, and they're looking at them. But with regard to savings, I think, you know, it's fair to say that before savings are put forward, then the heads of service have got to look at them. They've got to produce an impact assessment. And I'd like to think that they were pretty confident that those savings could be delivered without too much impact. That hasn't always been the case, and I'd accept that, but in the majority of cases, that type of impact is considered beforehand. So I'm not over concerned at the moment with regard to resource going forward to deliver the programme. But yes, it's something we've got to keep a very, very close eye on. And there is a level of flexibility anyway, because as we go forward, obviously there are going to be occasions when we're going to have to invest to save, and that might include recruiting some more temporary staff or something on that basis. And I'm sure we can accommodate that. But at the end of the day, you know, it goes without saying that we've got to deliver the programme. You know, our senior managers now are pretty well versed in change management procedures, and I'm sure that they'll pick up this type of threat pretty early on. With regard to the outage is very, very difficult, really, because it's not really a cyber attack. And I think the concern there is when you get an outage, you know, Microsoft in particular, it's more about having the confidence, really, that you can recover from it quickly. And that's perhaps what we need to look at in that instance. But yeah, it's a valid point, Chris. Thanks for that.
Thank you, David. Just a couple of quick queries from myself, Jane. You just described the risk budget as a budget rather than the reserve. And where does that sit within either? Which table would that sit in? If it was Appendix A, the first table there, does it sit in a line there, or does it sit on the reserves table at all?
No, it sits within the revenue budget. It is an annual budget allocation within that revenue allocation, and it sits in the table. If you look at Appendix A, it is actually included in the corporate activities line.
Okay, so £37 million there.
That's correct. So if you see right at the end, in terms of the outturn position there, it's currently showing an underspend of 3.3 million. Yeah. And that's because that's where the risk budget sits. And until it's agreed for allocation, obviously it shows there as not being utilised at the moment. So with the environments proposed, you will see that go down as we move that funding to the services as they are approved.
Okay. What did you say it was? £5 million? 3.
The risk budget is 3. Yeah.
So how much of that has been used, well, allocated through this report?
Now you're asking me. It's included in the environment, so I'll have to do a quick totting up to see how much it actually comes to.
So the forecast out turn on that is a positive position of £3.3 million on the corporate activities.
It is, but once those allocations have been done, it will bring that down. Doesn't change the overall position because it's a movement before. But Mary very kindly has given me a total, and currently the environments represent about £940,000 worth of that risk budget being allocated.
Is it very early in the year to, you know, and that's my point from my first intervention earlier on, really, about that sudden change of direction. Is it very early in the year to use that a third of that risk budget?
Not really, because what you're doing is allocating for the full year on individual circumstances. So where that pressure is already showing itself, then obviously you need to fund it through the whole of the financial year. So the allocation will be made on that basis. So where we're making those environments now, that is the total for the year, not just that they need immediately. And I think that's the important thing to note. Okay.
And yes, no, there's been a lot of talk in the press about peer review bodies going forward. And as you said, I guess we can pick this up later on as well. I think a percentage difference in pay will cost the council 1.8 million, or just under £2 million.
Absolutely.
I was just wondering, how much of a pay reserve have you got? Is it worth equivalent of 1%, 2%, 3%?
I think it gives a significant coverage to be able to manage a percentage. I think at the moment that the discussions are around 5%. Yeah. So we know that we would have sufficient to meet. I think we probably only have sufficient to meet a 1-year pressure of 1-2%. But obviously that has an impact then on future financial years as well, and it's that pressure that would actually impact on our budget gap and increase it in the future years. But we can manage it in this individual year. Yeah,
it goes straight into the base budget, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
For the costs going forward. A couple of other queries really. The reserves. The significant use of reserves there, but there's a lot of rollover from previous financial year, and hence, sorry, I'm trying to scroll down to the reserves table. If I can find it, table 3 on page 4 on my papers. So there's substantial use of reserves there, £13.5 million of other specific reserves. There is schools delegated reserves, does show an usage there of just under £3 million following the presentation of the draft budgets in May by the schools. However, that's not part of the policy, the 4% reserves policy. It just it excludes that, doesn't it? The schools delegated budget. So there's real risk there, because if those schools close or something, that money will be required from the general reserve. Has it always been like that? Has the schools delegated reserves been outside that 4%? Or
it has.
It has always been, because it would make a significant difference, wouldn't it? Now that we're moving from a surplus position to a deficit position on schools delegated reserves. Would you give consideration to changing that policy and including delegated reserves as part of that? Well, it doesn't have to be possibly review the 4% at the same time, because it will impact the general reserve, won't it? That's my point. This paper sort of separates out the delegated. This HRA. They shouldn't have. It should be a negative impact. Really, there's assets there within that, and that's a properly ring-fenced account. But the schools delegated, I have real concerns about that, especially as we're moving into a deficit position.
I think there's reference to the schools reserves in the report that we're going to look at shortly, so I can pick up in more detail then. But in terms of schools delegated, regulation dictates how they're held within our accounts, and they are specific for schools under the scheme of delegation and so on, so we have to report them separately. Although they don't feature in that calculation, they are clearly a risk for the council, irrespective of them being ring-fenced, because it is in the realms of the county council itself. So we have to be mindful of the position for both those and the HRA in terms of our overall assessment of reserves. And we do make that assessment on an annual basis before we're setting those limits and so on going forward. So absolutely something we will keep under constant review.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure you do consider that, but I was just wondering whether it needs to be made more explicit so members do understand the potential impacts of running up a deficit within the delegated budget. But but if you're constrained by regulations, I guess there's not a lot you can do about it. Okay. There's a couple of other points. Oh yeah, no, I've touched on the corporate risk and how much of that's left, and the PRU. But 5.2.7 is a real strange one to me. It's about school transport, and then the budget is calculated around 188 school days, and then this year the children are almost travelling going to school for a fortnight longer than what was budgeted for. How is that explained? I can see Mary's put a light on.
Yeah. Do you want to explain, Mary? I'll let you go first.
This one puzzled me as well. So it's to do with when the Easter holidays fall. So which financial year the Easter holidays fall. So in an academic year, it is around about the 190 days, but it won't necessarily be 190 days in each financial year. So that's why we've got that equalisation reserve there to manage that difference because of that. Yeah, the fortnight for the Easter holidays, basically. It's
as simple as that. You can't look forward when setting the budget last autumn to see where the Easter holidays are in the following years, because when I consider where the Easter holidays are when I turn out the rams to the sheep, so make sure labour supply is adequate. I would have thought the financing would take equal consideration, because there again, our reserve is being used to deal with that issue.
Mm-hmm.
If I can chip in, I think the main point here, we wouldn't want that budget fluctuating in the base budget year on year. So that's why we don't amend the base budget. The base budget is held at that average around 190 days, and then we pay into the reserve on years where we've got less days in the calendar year and vice versa. So it's so that you don't disrupt that overall revenue budget. You manage it through that reserve.
Okay. So, but there's no excuse to do it 188 rather than 190 then, was it?
No.
Thanks for explaining that one. I highlighted 529 as well for some reason. Oh yeah, how long has that reserve been in position? This remedial repair reserve, has it been there 3 or 4 or 5 years?
Don't think it's that long. I think it was one. Oh, Mary's put a hand up. Perhaps she can give you the information.
Was that at the end of the previous council, was it?
It's there was significant put into it at the end of this last year. So I think it's a relatively new specific reserve.
Okay. Why was it put into a reserve rather than rolled over?
it was part of that sort of building our resilience up really for the future. So it was part of how we used some of the outturn position really, and it allowed us to do that and put, because the works were scheduled for this year.
You know, yeah, it doesn't, when you read that, it doesn't sound as though it was just put in place in March and it's been used immediately, but could that just be checked at some point?
Yeah, sure.
Diolch yn fawr, Mari. Then the environments to cabinet, and these are, well, significant grants received as well. When were those grants known about? There's almost 1.5 million for adult social services. Is that something that's fallen into the budget in the first quarter, or were they known about before? Because it makes quite a difference to the budget for adult social care.
We'd have to check exact dates, but I think these are grants that I think the housing support grant is a grant that's been allocated year on year. But obviously it's not built into the budget until we have the clear letter awarding the grant and understanding the full value of it. So we have to then go through this process, obviously, to wire that money in when we are more up to date on what's included and the terms and conditions around it as well.
So you don't take an estimate and put it in the budget and then just vary it slightly once the known total has come through?
No, we wait to have confirmation it's coming before we build it in.
Okay, if you could just check the dates for me, please. Thanks. Any other questions from much of this paper does overlap with the later paper in a way, doesn't it? To some degree. So any other questions on this? And if not, we'll move on to the capital outturn. Okay, no questions. So David, back to you if you want to give a quick overview of the capital budget at this very early stage in the financial year.
Yes, just a very brief overview of the capital forecast for 24-25 as at 30th of June 2024. So the report before you provides an update on the financial position of the Council's capital programme as at 30th of June 2024. Following the successful award of additional grants and the reprofiling of budgets between financial years, the revised programme for 24-25 is budgeted at £124.73 million. At the end of Q1, actual spend amounts to £10.45 million, representing 8% of the total budget. 47% or £58.93 million of the capital expenditure is budgeted to be financed by borrowing. The interest costs for this is charged to the revenue accounts. Section 3 of the report details the grants that have been received and included in the capital programme. Services will be asked to review their budgets during Q2 to ensure their allocations in the capital programme accurately reflect their plans for this year. Section 5 sets out the following environments. The first is a request to transfer £0.1 million revenue funding to capital, as the IT equipment purchase for schools is capital in nature. And the second is a request for £0.15 million capital funding to carry out works in County Hall, Radnorshire Museum and the Rosford Day Centre. This is to provide dedicated space for frontline services after the closure of the Gwalia and Neuadd Brycheiniog. With regard to capital receipts, £0.03 million has been received to date, with a further £0.28 million received for the housing revenue account. There are currently sales agreed to the value of £5.46 million. These are at the legal stage of the process and will generate future capital receipts. At this stage, it's expected that sales totalling £9.89 million could be achieved this financial year. There remains a significant risk to achieve annual target of £10 million capital receipts. I don't know if the One Fine Warden officer would like to add anything to that.
Thank you much, David. Any questions from members? Can I just kick off? Oh, go on, Pete.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, I was struggling with the sausage fingers on the audio button there, so apologies. Just had 2 questions around the grants, if I may. Section 3.5 talks about active travel grants. So I just wanted to understand how that is allocated, because I've got a very deserving case in my ward that residents really do need. And then 3.7 around the 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. I thought that they were all implemented now. So is that money going to be used to support the unwinding of the 20s back to the 30s?
I'm guessing these are slightly specific around the individual services, but if you can help, Jane.
I think from the active travel, and I'll look to James in case James knows more than I do, but I think I'm not aware how that work is planned. We would have to follow that up with the service to know how it's allocated. It may well be that we bid on a certain basis and then funding is then allocated from that. But again, I can check on that. So sorry, Councillor Pearce, I can't give you that information at this point in time. I can't remember what the 20-mile-an-hour limit, that still relates to the implementation of the 20-mile-an-hour. As we know, there is discussion about whether that is retained, and I think there's more information coming through now for local authorities to consider. But I think there were some elements that weren't necessarily covered with the general rollout, and there was some flexibility for authorities to put more of those restrictions in if needed or requested by communities. So I think that award relates to the early scheme rather than any revisions now.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon, James. I was looking through all my screens to see your name, but I couldn't find it initially. But thank you, sir, and I'm sure you'll jump in whenever response is needed on capital. Gareth.
Thank you very much. Just going back around the staffing area again, because that's my thing for the day, I think. These grants, do they include staff on costs incorporated with these grants, or is that separate? Because obviously the costs of grants, it's all well and good getting grants, but they've got to be operated and everything else with that, and it does put extra costs on the authority. So I'm just wondering if they are incorporated within the report, or do they sit in the just the general and general report? So obviously these grants that we get does cost the authority money, and I'm just wondering where that comes up, because you look at some of these figures, you think, oh, they're nice, a bit of money to spend on communities, but actually it's not that, because you've got to pay the staff on costs.
James, Jane, sorry, go on.
Do you want to go, James?
There's a bit of a mixture, isn't there? We have dedicated staff that work on some of these schemes, but then when schemes are designed up, such as the active travel ones and anything like that, the highways design team, part of their fees are claimed from the grant. So their costs go towards the grant. We don't pick up that, because that's a design cost and a capital cost of the scheme.
Hope that answers.
It was what I expected, but obviously it's just looking at this, and the public will be watching this, and they'll look at some of these figures and they'll think, oh, there's money to do this, there's money to to do some projects. But actually, when you start taking the on costs of what it does for grants and stuff like that, it does cost money. And then just one supplementary question to come in on that is, what about reclaw on grants that aren't spent, or grants that aren't spent specifically to the project? Do we ever have to pay back, and what was that? Because obviously we're spending the money internally, and it could be, we could have a loss on grants where actually we haven't fulfilled the scope of the projects. Just looking at these, just wondering, is there any risk to any of these?
Can I wanted to add something to your initial question around the overhead on grants. James is absolutely spot on in terms of what he covered, but what these grants don't generally cover is the administrative cost of administering the grants. So that generally is part of, you know, from a financial perspective, the work that we do is actually part of our core team. So that is a cost that falls on us and that we have to meet. I'll hand over to James for the other part, unless he wants me to answer, but I'll let him go.
My mind has gone completely blank what that question was then. I'm very sorry.
Basically, are we fulfilling all the grants? Are we getting the money? Are we getting fined, or do we have to add any money back last year? Obviously, these are grants for this year. Is there any risk to the authority if we do not complete these grants on these projects? That Welsh Government and other bodies could call the money back, and obviously then we spent a lot of money on the project and it then creates a deficit.
There is always a risk, but it very, very, very seldom happens. We claim as much as we claim as much as we're entitled to. We generally claim in arrears, so there's evidence before we've actually claimed the grant. So I've not known that we've had to repay any capital grants in my time here. So you know, there's no real risk that I can see.
They are subject to audit as well.
Yeah, you just wish Welsh Government would just put everything in the RSG and leave the county council decide how to spend stuff. Anyway.
I'm sorry, Alan, can I just come on that? And I think that is a really, really valid point. That is my concern, that we are changing to a culture of grants, which doesn't allow the authority to have the stability to move forward. And if it's not in our base budget, it's kind of a hand-to-mouth existence, and in arrears as well, does cause a number of problems. So it's all well and good the authority having grants, but if it's not put within our base budget, it does create lots of other issues and lots of paper and everything else not delivering for our residents because we are paper chasing.
I think that's something that's been going on for years, and it'll continue to some degree. A certain amount of grants are rolled into the RSG every year, and to some degree. So when they do get established, there's a little bit of that. Jane, you still have your hand up.
Yeah, it was on that point. I think this is a point that we've pushed very heavily with Welsh Government around the use of grants and, you know, getting as much as possible through the RSG. And we have seen those transfers of some grants, but there is a commitment from Welsh Government to reduce the number of specific grants and to do as we're asking really in terms of that. So I know that commitment is there. And as I said, we do see some transfer in every year, but not to a significant degree at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Just a quick question on the capital receipts. It's expected to be £5.5 million this year. Is a substantial part of that made up with that one particular land sale in the north? Because a similar sum was mentioned in this report last year as well. Or is that an additional, because that receipt still has not been received from my understanding?
Your understanding is correct, that hasn't been received, and I believe it's part of that 5 million figure that's mentioned there.
Okay, it's still the same money as in the report last year.
Yeah.
Okay, and thanks. And the total of, well, it's almost £10 million, and you've got a target of £10 million a year within the medium-term financial plan, haven't you? I think from memory.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions on the outturn, quarter one outturn of the capital? Clearly it's very early stages again, and you know, and there's always rollovers at the end of the year. I can't remember what the total spend was last year off the top of my head. Probably 75-ish% was it, or that sort of region?
It's usually between about 60 and 65 million.
Oh, it's been overly optimistic in that case, but I know there's always that tension between trying to achieve something and not getting it over the line by the end of the financial year. So thank you, James, for your time. I know it's a huge amount of work, the capital programme, and making sure everything runs smoothly. So can we go on now to the next item on the agenda, if I can get there, which is I think it's the forward-looking part, isn't it? There we are. The financial planning update report, and this was to follow. So I hope all the members have got a copy of that.
On Wednesday, Chair.
If I've got apologies, thank you, Kath. I've got it open in one of my windows, but I just can't find which window it is. Do you want to, Jane? You were going to kick off on this one, weren't you? I think was it your report? I don't remember now.
It's in Councillor Davies' notes. I don't know if Councillor Davies wants to give an overview. Because
I still haven't found the actual report.
Thank you, Jane. This is quite it is a detailed report. It's quite a chunky report. So obviously, even after breaking it down and trying to appreciate it, it's still a lengthy report. But the purpose of the report is to provide Cabinet with will provide Cabinet to provide Finance Panel in this case with an update on the latest economic projections and how these influence and impact on the development of the Council's budget for 25-26 and the medium-term financial strategy. The economic situation continues to challenge the Council, and although inflation does appear to have slowed, it continues to impact on the cost of delivering Council services. This report sets out the key factors impacting on our financial planning and how these change the assumptions we use in developing our budget plans going forward. Now, as I said, there's a lot of detail in the reports, and I don't think I'll do it just if I try and cover everything in the way I've done it here in preparation for it going to Cabinet, but perhaps it might be better if Jane talks us through it, if that's acceptable.
That'd be great, David. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think the report did come to you after the agenda was published. I think that's noting the amount of work that's gone into this, but we were keen to get it before yourselves and Cabinet before the summer break, because obviously it's a key part of our financial planning. So hence the short turnaround. So apologies for that, Chair. I think if I pick up on some of the main factors, I think section 3 of the report picks up on the economic and fiscal outlook. Clearly, we have to be mindful of that overall economic position across the country, and that is obviously something we've considered as part of this work, but also in terms of any information coming out of Welsh Government. So you will see the Minister's letter there, where she is quite clear that Welsh Government are having a significant challenge in terms of their planning, and they are having to deploy their resources in the most effective way possible for them to meet their priorities. So obviously that will then have that impact on ourselves. Now, we don't know what that might look like with any certainty at the moment, but we are working on as much information out there as possible. And the Wales Fiscal Analysis report that looked at the potential consequences of the manifestos for the incoming UK governments really helped us focus in on what that was telling us as well. And it's clear from their report that the settlements for local government, as you will see in the table there at figure 2, are under significant pressure and challenge. So this is clearly showing that they could well be flat cash or negative in terms of that forward projection. So that is helping us then shape our planning assumptions as we move through the next few years. From the wider economic position, you've got information in here, obviously, from the Bank of England and the interest rates that have remained unchanged for some time. But clearly, we keep an eye on the forward projections there from the experts that we rely on for that as well, and consider that as part of our plans. Section 4 of the report then starts to understand the potential impact on the council of all of those factors, and this starts to build up a much more detailed picture of our assumptions built into our own individual plans. These will not be constant. This will continue to change as more information becomes available. We will have spending reviews and so on in the autumn, and that may again change these plans. So, you know, these are not fixed in stone. They will constantly change, and as we reflect and respond to the changing environment around us. General inflation has now come down and has been consistent for 2 months at 2%. That being said, the cost increases that we've seen over the last few years are still there. It just means that that ongoing increase has slowed. So we've considered that in our forward plans, together more so with some of the individual elements that are significant in terms of that inflation. And energy cost is a key factor for us, where we've seen energy costs come down, and we've looked to see that over the medium term as well in terms of how we respond to that. So that's something that we've picked up on. Pay, obviously, we've spoken about in the previous report, so I won't touch on that. It is, as you say, a significant proportion of our overall budget, and that 1% change is equivalent to 1.8 million. So any change there has that significant impact on the council. Pension costs, in terms of the local government pension scheme, that is fixed. We knew we were seeing a reduction over a 3-year period, and that is built into our plan. But in terms of the teachers' pension scheme, the actuarial review that took place on that particular scheme has seen a change implemented from April 24. And that saw the contribution rate increase by 5%. Now, that has a significant impact on our schools. At the moment, and we are waiting confirmation of this, our planning assumes that pressure, which is around 3 million for Powys schools, will be funded from central government. That was what happened last time, but we do not have that certainty. So we have flagged that up as a potential risk in our plans. Inflation obviously impacts on a lot of the other services that we commission, and in some instances, contracts will not be aligned to general inflation. There may be other indices that we rely on for those contracts. So as part of the service pressures that we consider, we do look in detail at those potential impacts arising from those contractual obligations. The other element obviously is around construction and material costs. We've seen quite a hike in those costs over the last couple of years, and that remains an impact for us. So clearly we are looking at that and incorporate that into our ongoing plans. There is a section there on schools, looking at the school budget plan submitted by governing bodies for the current financial year. We know schools drew on their reserves quite heavily last year and intend to again this year. And that is something that will have a considerable level of focus with Cabinet now as we plan for the future years. And we will have to look at the appropriate level of funding in terms of the funding for our schools. So that will be a significant part, I think, of the debate as we move through the next few months. That being said, we have done a lot of work in the background around that budget plan. You'll recall that when we approved the budget through council back in March, that the gap for 25-26 was sitting at 18 million. We have already done some significant things. I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for. And we've already brought that potential gap down. Now, some of that will be around the assumptions around general inflation and so on. They will have impacted. And the table that you see in 4.16 shows you where those changes have been. So you can see there's pay inflation and non-pay inflation reductions have had an impact on the plan. But also you can see against the savings line there, we've got nearly £4.5 million worth of proposals already coming forward as part of the debate around the budget now over the next few months. That being said, it still leaves us with a 9.6 gap for next financial year. But I think in terms of the approach we've taken and looking to tackle this as early as possible, you're starting to see the benefit of that coming through here, but still some significant work to be done. And then you can see at the bottom of that table, we recognise that potential teachers' pension pressure as well. I think we've moved some into above the line because we have concern about whether or not it will be fully funded. So we've taken a punt in terms of where we think that might be, just to give us a little bit of reduction in risk in terms of holding that outside of the budget plan. Section 5 looks at the capital strategy. We have started to model, and they are estimates at this time, the ongoing liabilities of holding the assets that we currently have. As you can see in section 5.6 there, the council has around 650 individual assets. They vary from monuments to schools to farms, you know, right across the mix of our assets. And the total value of the assets we hold are reflected in our balance sheet at the moment of £492 million. So a significant level of assets held. But obviously they need to be maintained, they need to be run. So we are considering that clearly as we move through the next few years to see what is an appropriate level of assets to hold for the provision of council services. So that review continues. As part of that review, we are now better able to establish the requirements in achieving our buildings to become net zero in the future, and those costs are starting to be recognised within our plan. But as I said, they are very broad brush, and they are estimates at this point in time. That table shows a significant level of investment needed, and obviously that has a significant impact on our revenue budget as well. So clearly that is something we will focus on as we move through. In terms of balancing up the budget, particularly for next year and future years, the Sustainable Powers programme is a big factor in that. Cabinet have recently agreed the principles around that framework, and services are now working through that as they review their individual services, the delivery models that we may be able to do, and any changes in terms of transformation or other that can be implemented to help us bring those costs and those liabilities down. Moving on then to the future funding, I know Councillor Elwyn's got his hand up. Do you want me to pause, or do you want me to get to the end?
How much more have you got to go?
Not a lot more, no.
Just go and do it, Elwyn, yeah? Yeah, carry on, Jane. He's on mute.
So the funding levels obviously have a key impact on us. I mentioned in terms of the Wales Fiscal Analysis report, our modelling continues to be based around those three scenarios. So we've built in a cash flat model as sort of the optimum option at the moment, but we do also model a 1% sensitivity around that as well. So we know what a -1 or a -2 or a +1 or a +2 commitment would look like, and we do model on all of those bases. In terms of council tax, you'll recall that the medium-term financial strategy approved by council back in March looked to model an annual 5% increase in council tax. There is no decision or no debate has been had around that with Cabinet or the wider council at this point in time. So our modelling continues to include that as a scenario at the moment, but that is the only basis of that. And for every 1% change in council tax, that equates to £1 million net of the council tax reduction scheme implications on that as well. You have then further information on the overall gap over the 5 years in section 8. And you can see with the changes that we've made, and by extending that plan for the new 5-year of the plan, then obviously it does change that gap, but we're still looking at a £9.6 million gap for next year, and a cumulative gap over the life of the plan of 50.9 million. That's based on flat cash. If our worst case scenario comes to fruition, then by year 5 we would have a £73.6 million gap over that 5-year period. More information then around Sustainable Powers, and the final section start to look at our financial resilience. We are looking at the FM code separately in this meeting later on, so I'm not going to dwell on that section specifically. We can pick up on that later on.
Okay.
Also focusing then on some of the key aspects of good governance around financial planning, and particularly the risks that we've seen that have affected other councils. So I would draw your attention to section 10.9 that clearly looks at the learning points and the key aspects of our planning, and those are sound governance, robust financial management, that continually looking forward, and honesty and acceptance of the situation that we face, and then working at pace to make those informed decisions, understand the risk, and obviously to act in terms of being able to balance our budget over the longer term. I'll pause.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for the report. I know it was late coming to us. However, it still feels dated to some degree, especially some of the earlier sections around the commentary from Cardiff Uni, and possibly stuff around manifesto commitments. And next Monday we'll see some sort of statement from UK government. This really does need, I know a lot of work has gone on it, but it really does need updating quite rapidly, possibly over the next few weeks. But that's just initial comments from me. Elwyn.
Diolch, Jane. My question and point basically is in relation to 5.6 and assets, and also ties in, I expect, then to the wider conversation about sustainable powers looking forward. As you rightly pointed out, there's a huge potential capital expenditure there, 447 million to achieve net zero. We're already in 2024, 2030 is not that far away. And of course, it has a potential 30 million annual cost of borrowing, a huge effect on our budget. I think, and I choose my words carefully, I think there needs to be a mature, honest conversation, not just in powers, but perhaps on an all Wales level, how achievable some of these targets are. And the reason I say that, the UN Convention on Climate Change set a 2050 net zero target with interim targets of 63% by 2030. Now, that's a huge difference to actually 100% target for 2030. And obviously, a third less would mean 10 million less costs per year. Now, I also note that the Welsh Government did have a 2035 net zero group. I'm not sure where that is at the moment. But I think we all want to achieve these aims as soon as possible, but I think we also have to be realistic and what can we achieve in reality. Are there conversations being held basically on a strategic level with other local authorities through WLGA or whatever, and specifically with Welsh Government? Because, if we say, right, 63% is a target for 2030 rather than 100%, it makes a huge difference to the potential planning and lightens some of the pressures on your shoulders, I would think. I don't know. Food for thought.
Diolch, Elwyn. Before I bring David in, Pete, are you on the similar sort of track or not? Do you want to add to that before bring David in?
Yes, I am, Aled. I was going to mention a few of the things Councillor Elwyn mentioned there. The one that Councillor Elwyn didn't mention that I was after is Jane. I'm sure you've told me many times before, and I've probably forgotten. But the cost of the borrowings in there at 30 million. Where does the cost of repaying the loan end up? Thanks, Chair.
Shall we just knock that one on the head quickly, Jane, on the repayment of the loan, and then I'll go to Councillor David on the Elwyn's substantive question.
Okay, I will pick up on Councillor Elwyn's point as well. So I haven't talked about minimum revenue provision for a long time. So Councillor Pete, what we do within our revenue budget is we set aside a level of funding to be able to repay that debt in the future, and that's what we call the minimum revenue provision. I probably won't go into the detail of how that is calculated. I can do so outside of the meeting, but it is quite complicated to explain. And I know James is here and you do a far better job than me, but I think we could tie you up for a little while. But just so that you are comfortable, we do make a provision that does enable us then to repay that debt in the future, and we'll give you more information around that. James has put his light on, so he may well come in on that one. If I can just very briefly touch on what Councillor Elwyn said around those targets. I mean, those are the target dates that local authorities are being asked to consider at the moment, so that would need a national change. But for me, we can only invest when we can afford to do it. So, you know, as the whole part, it's important to understand what the cost of getting to that point is, because clearly we need to do everything we possibly can to reduce that liability. But we have to be mindful of the overall impact on our budget. In terms of the national debate, as a Society of Welsh Treasurers, we are constantly discussing this with Welsh Government officials. I know in every seminar that I've been into with the WLGA and others over the last year, potentially, even probably before that, you know, we have constantly said, at the moment, no authority is in a place to be able to afford to invest to achieve that net zero commitment by 2030. I don't think anybody is, and we are clear on that, that without significant support from government to do that, we can't do that and fulfil all of our other obligations. So that's the position we find ourselves in, but definitely that debate is happening ongoing.
And it's extremely important for the council and the Welsh Government to understand the cost of their ask as well. So this does clarify that.
Starts to, yeah.
A little bit. Before, can I bring Councillor David in before James explains MRP in huge detail to Councillor Pete?
Yeah,
David.
Thank you, Chair. But basically, I was going to say much about what Jane has said in response to Councillor Elwyn. I do share the concern, you know, the net zero targets and the amount of capital expenditure involved, etc. It's pretty well impossible. We're certainly not going to be able to fund it out of our RSG or the capital allocations we're having currently. But I've always maintained that if we're going to achieve it on target, then it's going to take some input from Welsh Government and national government, because the figures we're talking about are astronomical, they're huge. And as Jane says, you know, with the Welsh Treasurers, they're always bringing it up there. It's always brought up at WLGA meetings I attend, because the financial pressure we're under anyway, and if we've got to deliver all this alongside that, then basically we need some help. So that's a concern I share with you, Councillor Elwyn. There is a lot of good work going on within the authority, mind around climate and nature, and there's some action plans being produced. We're now looking to actually cost some of those action plans so we can understand what we can deliver ourselves. There's a lot already been done. It might on the surface appear like a little bit of tinkering around the edges when you look at the big picture, but it's a credit to services that they are working away at it. But as you say, it's a huge task, and we will need some assistance in that. I just wanted to pass comment on the report itself and some of the economic data that was included in it. Councillor Ali is quite right to say that it is dated, particularly some of the sort of UK data in there. But at the same time, you know, we make no secret, we're talking about assumptions and projections. I think, you know, if you look at the earlier the Wales fiscal analysis, that came out just before the election, so it's not that old in inverted commas, and they did produce two scenarios based on the sort of fiscal planning of both parties that might have formed the next government. And we know where that is now, and we're pretty sure, you know, that there's a fair level of accuracy within that to actually put forward a projection of sorts, because we've got some evidence to base it on. But I think, in fairness to the report, you know, it does talk about assumptions, and assumptions, there's a level of uncertainty within assumptions, and that's because the economic situation is so fragile. It's changing all the time. And I think we were talking this morning, you know, about a potential interest rates, 0.25% interest rate cut next week when the MPC sits, but that's not guaranteed, because although we've got 2% general inflation, CPI inflation, service inflation is still incredibly high at over 5%, and pay inflation is even higher again, 5.7%. And those two factors alone will determine whether the MPC will actually drop interest from 5.25% down to 5%. But that's by the by, that's just an example. The other thing we've got to bear in mind is the fact that inflation has come down quite rapidly, but it's up against incredibly high figures from last year because of the energy crisis. So that's going to stall it again, so that there could potentially be an impact there. And then, you know, you've got the geopolitical situation, and that's incredibly fragile. And one little upset there, and the whole thing's going to turn upside down, and we could be back to square one. But so the point I'm trying to make is that all in all, with what we do know, I think the assumptions that are contained in the report aren't going to be a million miles away unless there's a major upset within the economy.
Thank you. Thank you, David. No, you do talk about the borrowing figures. I'm guessing that PWLB numbers there are they fixed, and the government won't change those until interest rates changes. But the bank rates, there's a discount there already. I'm assuming when they look forward. So and that's why they, you know, in 2027 you're looking at a difference of a couple. Oh no, well, over 1% between the two, and it tends to be the other way around, if anything, to some degree, doesn't it? Sorry, just slightly distracted. James, you were going to come in and pick up on Pete's and, well, on anything else you wish to.
Yeah, I was just going to very quickly that £30 million interest annual cost of borrowing is a mixture of interest and principal repayment, the same way as your monthly mortgage would be a mixture of interest and principal repayment. So by the end of the 35 years or whatever that's worked over, we should have repaid all of that debt out of that cost there.
And the length of that borrowing reflects the life of the asset, doesn't it? Which is a change that was made 1 or 2 years, well, not that long ago, really.
Yes.
Just quickly onto that table where it does talk about the cost of net zero and the total. There's a certain amount of overlap between those columns as well, isn't there? There's a maintenance, well, for schools, for example, there's maintenance of 91 million, and then in the next one, you've got the improvements to schools as well. So one would cancel off the other to some degree. Is it? So it's not completely fair to add them all together to achieve the last column. Or am I being, or are you making allowances for that with your £100 million in the second column?
They are distinct figures to get to that, to get our estates fully backlog maintenance done and to net zero. For schools, it would be, the last year's figure was 91 million, plus we think at least 273 million more to get them to operational net zero. Yeah.
But if you spend £100 million on plus the Welsh grant, you wouldn't have to do all the 91 million, would you? Or possibly the 100 million or the 273 million.
There may be a bit of overlap there, but as time goes on, I think probably
you're underestimating it. That's what you,
yeah,
to some degree. Okay. Thank you. Pete, you did have your hand up a moment ago. Did you want to come back on the
yeah, sorry, Ali, it may be me being a bit thick. I think I'm getting there, so thanks Jane and James, but I think, as I said in audit this morning, I'm a simple guy. I need some simple explanations. If I was just understanding there from the end, James, about the cost including capital repayments as well as the interest, if we're looking at the 563 total figure, and if we assumed in the 30 million that was £20 million of capital repayments, that means we're paying that for 28 years on the back of a fag packet. Is that right?
We'll have used the annuity method, and I think it works out at about an average. The average life of we work out the calculation over the life of the assets involved, and that's currently 35 years. So there's a mixture of interest at, I can't remember exactly what I used, 4.5% plus the repaying of the original 563 million. So yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, thank you, James. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, thank you, Pete. I got a couple of little questions if nobody else wants to dive in. I think the paragraph on the schools is quite an effective paragraph. Describes the challenges that we face. 4.14. However, you know, the first sentences or first couple of sentences is slightly misleading from my point of view. You know, there's a delegated budget there, and they've drawn £6 million out of reserves to help fund those schools. And then it says the actual draw was 5.8. It makes it sound as though it's a positive thing. You know, it's been reduced. I'm not really happy with the message that gets over, to be honest with you, because last year the school spent over £90 million on their within their delegated budgets. You know, the grants, the delegated budget grant from the council plus the use of reserves. Now we're moving into a negative position, and the council is knowingly underfunding the delegated budget. It's almost using, you know, expecting them to run up a deficit in order to save on a council tax increase. And I don't think that is a completely honest way of portraying the challenges, and it doesn't deal with the challenges quick enough, soon enough. I don't know, because, you know, the projections going forward are quite horrific. I know they don't always materialize, but the projections over the next 3 years are really, really difficult position when there's an overall deficit, not just in high schools, but the overall within all schools delegated. Jane.
I think firstly, in terms of the content of that paragraph, it's on a factual basis that we're putting it. If you're picking up messages, that's no intention. It is purely based on facts from that perspective. But I think when the budget was set and approved...
Sorry, I got to jump in there. Sorry, Jane. You know, call on reserves. Well, they're not reserves. They're deficits sitting in some schools already, aren't there? And the deficits there are increasing. It makes it yeah. So, you know, it doesn't give the full story. Sorry, Jane.
I forgot what I was going to say now. I think when council approved the budget back in March, you know, there was very much thought gone into the balance there in terms of the available funding available for schools as part of that overall budget, alongside the reserves that schools, not all, I appreciate that some are in a deficit, and we are working with schools continually, as you know, to help to manage that as best we can. In terms of the forward projections, and this is my advice as a 151 officer, we cannot get to that position. This is looking at, you know, schools have modelled on a flat cash basis, but clearly that is not confirmed or approved by anybody at this point in time. We felt it was better to model on that basis, with that being the indication of what the council is likely to receive. But that whole debate around the level of funding that goes into those school budgets for subsequent financial years is something that still yet has to be worked through. So I just want to give that assurance, you know, we will not get to that position. We can't get to that position. It is not what any of us would want to see over the longer term.
You know, I think the high schools were talking about £4.5 million deficit at the end of this financial year. You know, and I know you take it into account in the background when you're talking about the risk to the council, but sometimes it's not that explicit. But that's tone, I guess. I'm guessing the difference between my views and yours. David.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up the point about us deliberately underfunding schools. That simply isn't the case, because every penny we've received in our RSG, we've passported over to schools. And I think it's just worth pointing out as well that the teams around the school, particularly around the deep dives, they've done some excellent work in schools, and they have found significant savings. Really significant savings. I think, you know, the intention was that we attempt to try and stabilize the in-year budgets, and then once we achieved that, then we tackle the overall deficit. And we've gone some way to doing that. And you know, as soon as we were convinced that schools are actually in a position where whatever financial settlement they get, that budget is being managed, you know, effectively, then we can move forward again. And if there are schools that for whatever reason the funding formula isn't addressing the structural concerns within the school itself, then obviously we might require further intervention, but that's something for the future. But you know, as Jane said, that there's no way that we can allow a situation where we reach £15 million deficits in schools, and that's not going to happen. And there's still an awful lot of good work going on. I think the new Director of Education has actually got 3 experts working in the different schools, secondary, primary, special schools, etc., just to help them along the way in managing their budgets. But once all this work is complete, we'll have a clear picture, it'll be a level playing field, and we can decide on the way forward. But we certainly not going to end up in a situation where we've got a deficit in schools of £15 million.
Yes, it simply can't happen, can it? So I appreciate that. But when you talk about passporting all of the Welsh Government funding on, yes, it was at 4.2%.
4.2.
4.2, but that only accounts for 70% of the funding, doesn't it? 30% of the funding comes from council taxpayers as well.
Yeah.
And that wasn't passported on at the same level of the increase as council tax increased. So it didn't do as well as some other parts of the council. The deep dives, I know the learning and skills looked at that, but the deep dives are focused on schools that are already in deficit. And they were going even into deeper deficit, but there are a significant number of schools with surplus at this moment in time, but heading towards deficit. And there haven't been any deep dives into those schools because they will have an equal influence on the overall level of deficit or surplus of the school's estate. And in a number of schools, those deep dives have not yielded any savings. There have been in some schools, but not all schools. That's important to understand. And the director was very clear that he is seeking external advice to help on that, which clearly is needed when you look at the state of the or the challenges, I should say, challenges that the schools face.
But worth bearing in mind, any school can request a deep dive. If schools have got concerns that they can't manage their budgets, then they can request a deep dive, and I'm sure the service will be more than happy to go into that school.
Yeah, yes, but
you know, the point I was trying to make is, you know, if you're suggesting that we simply throw money at the problem before we satisfy ourselves that things are being managed properly, that would be foolhardy because of the current financial situation we're finding ourselves in. Because you know, it would be totally irresponsible to suggest that we just spend money to solve a problem. We've got to understand that problem, look at the root cause, etc., and then address it. And because if you're going to start pushing money right, left, and centre into different services without first understanding the problems inherent in those services, then it's other services suffer. We've got to get the bottom of this and fully understand the root cause, and then take it forward. And if it does require extra funding, then that's something we might have to consider.
I don't think we disagree on this at all, but it's it's the timeliness of that intervention, which is so important when you're going forward. When secondary schools have got a make sure I'm looking at the right column now, of a £4.5 million projected deficit at the end of this financial year. It is it is going to have a huge impact going forward, because of the. It's one thing to balance an in-year deficit or balance an in-year budget, and not many schools are doing that at the moment. If you scan through the report that's going to Cabinet next week, that initial first column is almost completely red, as in every school budget is in deficit in this financial year. But and it's partly because I'm stressing on this a bit because it's one of our biggest services. Between this social services and children's services, it's over £200 million of the £350 million net budget. So it's a big chunk of our budget, and I think there needs to be equal focus on adults and children's as well. But thank you. Sorry, any other issues that panel members want to pick up on this paper before we leave it? When do you routinely update this paper, or is when you feel there's enough time? What's your approach to it, Jane?
I think what we've done is we've done this sort of general update as early as we can. Time's moved on, hasn't it, since February when the medium-term financial year was set, and of course there have been, we're still being severely impacted by the economic situation. So we've done this update now. No doubt we will be doing it again and refreshing it even more in September when we get a bit more information, and then in response to the spending reviews and all of those things that happen, we're going to have to continually refresh it. So the paper and the content is quite extensive. It takes time to pull together, but obviously we will look to refresh it, maybe not quite as the overhaul you've seen here, but obviously we'll keep updating it and keeping council updated through the autumn and prior to it coming formally as part of the budget process later on in the year.
Okay, thank you. Between this paper and the Q1 outturn, I can't remember where I saw the table, but there was assumption on the it's just this paper was this paper here on table in 4.16, where for a change red numbers are a good number on page 10. Yeah. Sorry, Jane, you muted.
Sorry. Yes, they are. In that instance, they are better.
Yeah, okay. But there, you've got the Welsh Government increase there on the assumption of, is that 1%?
It's on a flat cash basis rather than a -2.
Okay, so the Feb assumption was a -2, was it?
It was.
But potentially there's a 1%. Well, I guess that's overall government expenditure of 1% in real terms, isn't it? Going forward for the autumn budgets, how would that reflect itself here? Is that flat cash, or would you expect that to be better than flat cash?
Well, this is flat cash. We're keeping, I think, discussions across SWT. People are modelling on the same basis. If it improves, then obviously we would model that through, but similarly, if it declines as well, we will model that through as well. So that's why we do the test in terms of that sensitivity around a 2% positive, 2% minus, so that we've got that in mind. But this at the moment is based on the flat cash scenario.
Okay, and then the teacher's pension, will that have to wait till the potential budget in the autumn sometime?
We hope to hear more information about that soon, because it's happening already. Those costs are being incurred, so we need to know about that.
Okay, because these are big sums of money, Okay, and the table further down when you're looking at the 4 or 5 years going forward, I can't find it at the moment. What's the assumption on the Welsh Government funding there?
Again, you can see it's flat cash going forward.
Which page is that? Sorry, Jim.
It's
I found it now 15.
8.1 in
That's it.
terms of
Yeah,
the paragraphs. You can see Welsh Government, look, it says in the table 0% onwards.
0% onwards. Okay. Okay, so you haven't repeated that -2 anywhere else.
Not at the moment.
Don't say that, Jane. Right. Sorry, Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If I could ask Jane about that table at 8.1, where did disposal receipts come in on that?
They don't show in that particular table because this is the revenue budget. And of course, capital receipts fall into reserves and they're used to support the capital programme. So you don't see them in here. But what you will see in terms of the revenue budget, where we propose changes to the level of funding we hold to support capital from revenue, you would see that feature as a change. So if we decide to draw on capital receipts more so in next year or the year after, alongside the investment needed will depend on that balance of capital receipts and additional borrowing. So you don't usually see capital receipts featuring, well, you just won't see them featuring as part of that revenue plan.
But if you increase your asset sales, you won't have to borrow so much money, so it would reduce your revenue expenditure.
It would. So at the moment, what we've got, I think we haven't built in at the moment any significant increase in that borrowing budget, but we will need to include that when we've got the full details of that asset review. But in doing so, that will reflect the use of capital receipts.
Yeah, I got you.
So that capital financing now is commitments already made, that line.
Yes. Yes.
So that's the table, previous table with the net zero and stuff is nowhere near that yet, is it?
It's not in here yet. No.
Just to make it clear. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. Thank you, Gareth. And any other questions, members? There's a lot of information here. I'm sure if you drop Kath and myself, we can forward any question, any queries you have when you reread it. Drop a line to myself and Kath, and we'll pass them on to Jane and David for any clarification needed. So no more questions. Brilliant. No more hands up on the thing. Right. Thank you very much. We'll go to the forward work program item 6 on pages 41 and 42. I must be completely honest, I haven't looked at this latest version. Kath, have there been any changes to this?
No, Chair.
Sorry?
No, Chair.
No.
Sorry. No, Chair, sorry.
It sounds as though you're a million miles away from my microphone. Okay. Anything, and there's standing item there about the sustainable powers going forward as well, isn't there? Just one thing, Councillor David, message to Cabinet. Therefore, your forward work programme isn't brilliant. Finance is good on it. No fault on your part, but it's the forward work programme for Cabinet is quite sparse in some points. It'd be good if that was strengthened to some degree. Thank you. Back to the agenda. The last item on the agenda is a confidential item around the FM code, the Financial Management Code. We need to go into confidential mode, hence the exit item on item 7. Can we have a proposal that we go into, Gareth? You read my mind and read the agenda.
I propose we go in confidential
we
session, Chair.
all agree to go into confidential session. I can see at least 3 hands, myself, 4 hands. I'm sure that's majority. Anybody against? Nobody against. That's fine. So we'll go into confidential session. Kath, can you